Let's dive right into our explainer today. Medusa, monster, victim, symbol. When you hear the name Medusa, I bet an immediate, super vivid image flashes right into your mind. You know the one, the dangerous woman with a writhing nest of snakes for hair. You instantly think of the terrifying Gorgon whose gaze literally turns anyone who looks at her into solid stone, right? We've all seen her defeated by the hero Perseus in countless movies, graphic novels, and ancient texts. But what if I told you that this incredibly familiar pop culture image is actually hiding something way more profound? The story of Medusa reveals that she's not just some static, fixed creature from an old myth that we can just put in a neat little box. No, she's actually a layered, shifting mirror. It's kind of like a bustling old city bazaar. Think about it. A local shopkeeper, a tourist, and a poet can all walk through the exact same marketplace, but that physical space holds completely different meanings for each of them. Well, Medusa works exactly the same way. The physical details, the snakes, the stone gaze, they stay completely recognizable, but her actual meaning changes entirely depending on who happens to be holding the pen.
So, to really grasp how this all works, we have to pause and ask ourselves a pretty central question. When we look at a terrifying figure like Medusa, are we looking at a true monster, or are we looking at a wound that the story has made visible? This is where things get absolutely fascinating, honestly. Because by asking this, we aren't just picking apart a character anymore. We're literally pulling back the curtain to see how stories actually function in our societies.
To get to the bottom of that, we have to fundamentally rethink what a myth actually does. A myth isn't a history lesson. It's a map drawn from experience, not from geography. Look, life is inherently messy. People suffer, they win, they lose, they desire things, they blame each other. And usually, there's no clear logical pattern to any of it. A myth takes all of that chaotic, tangled human experience and gives it a recognizable shape. It highlights and organizes these massive, abstract concepts like fear, blame, and power. It essentially acts as a lens. And a lens doesn't create the world, but it fundamentally changes how the world appears to us depending on which one we happen to be looking through. Now, we actually experience this kind of symbolic mapping every single day. Just think about a standard traffic signal. When you're driving, the color red doesn't just literally mean red. It means stop, it means caution, it means there's going to be a severe consequence if you ignore it. That one single color effortlessly organizes human behavior on a massive scale. Well, Medusa's image does the exact same thing, but instead of organizing traffic, it organizes feeling. Myths work by compressing incredibly complex ideas into one highly efficient, super memorable visual symbol. Because, let's face it, human beings remember symbols way more easily than we remember long, dry explanations. Medusa's terrifying face, her hair, her lethal danger, all of it becomes this immediate flashing signal that tells an audience exactly how to feel before they even have a chance to think about it. Ultimately, a myth is less like Friday night entertainment and more like a social rulebook written in story form. Myths teach a society exactly what it desperately wants to preserve. Sometimes that means courage, sometimes it's obedience, and a lot of times it's the fear of stepping out of bounds. They act just like the street signs of a culture's imagination, totally dictating what's considered safe, what's forbidden, and what will absolutely get you punished. And this brings us right to the first major lens through which the ancient world, and honestly, often our world too, views Medusa. And that is the monster. So, in the most familiar, heroic version of the myth, Medusa is purely the thing that must be defeated. It's a super clean binary, and it's completely designed to test courage. You've got order versus chaos, civilization versus danger, hero versus threat. When Perseus raises that mirrored shield to strike her down without meeting her deadly gaze, he becomes the ultimate agent of civilization simply because he destroys the ultimate creature of fear. But notice what's really interesting here. If Medusa is strictly a monster, the story never actually has to ask how she became one. Her sole job in the narrative is to be feared, not explained. And sure, that's an incredibly satisfying story format, but it very conveniently hides the underlying machinery of blame. Actually, scratch that simple good guy, bad guy routine. This simple narrative hides a much darker question. What if the monster was made? Asking this one question completely shifts the emotional center of the entire myth, and it moves us smoothly right into the victim phase. Instead of asking how to defeat her, we start asking, well, what forces shaped her into what she became? Suddenly, the myth introduces deep moral complication and injustice. Take the version told by the Roman poet Ovid, for example. In his telling, the goddess Athena curses Medusa for a violation that occurred in her temple, a violation that Medusa herself was the victim of. So now, it's no longer just a fun adventure story about a dangerous creature embodying chaos. It becomes a heavy story about systemic power acting forcefully upon a vulnerable body.
This creates a really profound conceptual shift for us. It's a complete move from threat to testimony. Think about it. When Medusa is read as a victim, her terrifying features fundamentally change meaning. Her writhing snake hair, her freezing gaze, the frozen victims scattered around her lair, these are no longer just an active, aggressive threat to the hero. They transform into evidence. They literally become signs that something deeply violent happened to her long before the heroic story we usually hear even started. The gaze that once looked purely monstrous, it now begins to look exactly like a visible wound. The myth starts doing two things at once. It preserves the old fear of her power while completely exposing the injustice behind that fear.
And because the myth is so incredibly flexible, it allows her to step totally beyond her own story and become a universal symbol. Modern culture uses her image constantly. We see it everywhere, from high-fashion logos like Versace to fierce protest art on the streets. She's used to represent female rage, the heavy burden of unwanted attention, the unfair punishment of beauty, and the harsh realities of survival after violence. She basically represents the absolute danger of being incorrectly seen and judged by society. And she can hold all of these really complex meanings because the original figure already contains so many intense opposites, you know? She is beautiful and terrifying. She is incredibly vulnerable, but also entirely lethal. To really visualize how this symbolic power works, I want you to picture Medusa as a wax seal stamp being pressed into different kinds of paper. The recognizable physical mark of the stamp, the snakes, the fierce face, that stays exactly the same every single time. You always instantly know it's her. But the surrounding document, the cultural page she's stamped onto, completely changes the message. So a feminist essay, a political cartoon, a classic Renaissance painting, or a modern movie, they are all using the exact same recognizable figure, but they are stamping entirely different messages and meanings depending on what that specific storyteller wants or desperately needs to say about their own world. When we zoom out and look at the big picture, the underlying architecture of the myth becomes brilliantly clear. The surface changes drastically, right? She shifts from monster to victim to symbol. The moral emphasis wildly varies, from pure fear to deep sympathy to sharp social critique. But through all of this, what stays exactly the same? Well, Medusa remains instantly recognizable. The story fundamentally centers on her, and the figure carries undeniable power. This proves that while the moral of the story might bounce all over the place, the structural power of the myth remains totally 100% stable. The variation isn't breaking the myth at all. The variation is actually the myth working perfectly. And this brings us to a really crucial realization. Fear is never just fear. It so often hides a judgment about who actually deserves power. When people tell a myth, they aren't just reciting facts about a character from antiquity. They are revealing exactly what their own culture thinks is worth fearing, what's worth admiring, and ultimately who deserves to be blamed. A reaction to Medusa, the specific version of her that we choose to highlight, actually acts as a test. But it's not a test of Medusa. It's a test of us, the storytellers. Imagine looking at a stained glass window from the outside of a building. From the outside, it's just dark, confusing shapes. But step inside, and the light reveals absolutely everything. Medusa is that light, revealing our own deep-seated societal judgments. Which leads us to our final powerful takeaway. You don't just know Medusa now. You understand why she keeps looking back at us. She endures precisely because she sits at the exact intersection where terror, injury, and meaning completely overlap. She is a permanent, infinitely layered mirror for whoever is holding the pen, holding the paintbrush, or directing the camera. You're no longer just remembering an old bedtime story. You now have the tools to diagnose it. So the very next time you see her familiar snake-haired image pop up in a movie or a book, don't just look at the monster. Ask yourself, who is describing her right now, and what do they want her to mean? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the stories you see.